when her bad trip kicked off, she imagined herself hearing the song. You mean like a group hallucination? More like a chain. She thought about it. I don't know. It makes more sense than it being a ghost, I said. Julia, there's always a rational explanation. This makes sense. I waited to see if she would buy it. I really didn't want to tell her I thought it was her. Eventually, she nodded. I'll talk to Karen about it in the morning, she said. Chapter 16. Lily. 2014. Megan's house was small but cosy. She had a black Labrador called Barney who was lovely, though he kept letting out rancid farts that made Lily and Megan squeal with horror. I'm going to take him to the vet if he doesn't stop, said Megan's mum, who was really pretty and trendy. She was fun, too. She knew all about YouTube and had the radio playing in the kitchen, singing along when Little Mix came on. She poured glasses of ice-cold Coke for Lily and Megan and carried the drinks into the front room, where they were playing a video game on Megan's Xbox. As soon as Megan's mum left the room, Megan said, Danny lent me this new game. Do you want to play it? Danny was a boy in their class. Danny was always going on about playing Call of Duty and watching gross stuff online with his older brother. What kind of game? Megan whispered. It's a scary game. I'm not supposed to play it, so if you hear Mum, come and yell. Lily shifted uncomfortably on the carpet as Megan located the game. Over by the fireplace, the dog made a groaning noise, and Lily braced herself for the stink. It was the start of the school summer holidays, the best 6 weeks of the year, and Lily and Megan were on what the grown-ups referred to as a play date. Dad had dropped Lily off earlier, telling her to be good. Don't go off on your own, he'd said. I know, and don't talk to strangers. Don't worry, Mr. Marsh, Megan had said. We're just going to play in the garden. I've got a pack of water balloons. But after soaking each other with the balloons and drying off in the hot sun, they'd come inside, and now they were doing what Mum said Lily was always doing, like it was the worst thing in the world, staring at a screen. It was massively unfair because Mum and Dad were constantly looking at their phones, even when they were supposed to be talking to each other. Megan put on a horror movie voice and said, Are you prepared to be scared? Lily found herself looking at a big house surrounded by winter trees. The graphics were pretty basic, but effective. It looks like your house, doesn't it? Megan said. Out there in the woods. Don't say that. Spooky music played, and Lily realized she was holding her breath as their character entered the house. What's in there? She asked. Megan's voice was hushed. Bloody Mary. Oh, God. I'm freaking out. Megan laughed. You're such a baby. Shut up. No, I'm not. On screen, they crept through a series of empty corridors into dark rooms filled with blocky furniture. Megan said, If Mary catches you, she takes you into her world. Lily swallowed. What's in her world? Megan smiled at her. Freaky stuff. Time moves backwards. There are people with zips for mouths and black holes where their eyes should be. And you'll never see your Mum and Dad again. I don't like it, Lily said. You really are a wimp. Megan concentrated on the game for a while, eyes stretched wide, and then suddenly a dark figure jumped out at them. Bloody Mary. Megan and Lily both screamed. Footsteps came towards the room. Megan lunged for the Xbox, turning it off before the door opened. What's going on? Megan's mum asked. Nothing, Mum, just Barney. He did the grossest fart ever. The dog rolled an eye towards them, as if he knew he was being blamed for something he hadn't done. Megan's mum pulled him to his feet. Come on, you horrible mutt. You can go in the garden for a bit. Leave these poor girls alone. Lily felt guilty after Megan's mum and the dog had gone. Poor Barney. Megan waited till she heard the back door open, then said, Have you ever done the Bloody Mary thing? You know, said her name 3 times in the mirror? No way. Shall we do it now? Lily had gone cold all over. Come on, scaredy cat, it'll be fun. Megan, no way. An annoyed look appeared on Megan's face, and Lily was worried she wouldn't want to be her friend anymore. She was about to say okay, she'd do it, when Megan laughed and said, Only kidding. Everyone knows Bloody Mary's not real anyway. She paused. Unlike the Red Widow. The moment of relief Lily had felt was blasted away. What do you mean? Megan's voice dropped to a whisper. The widow. She's real. I heard my Grandad talking about her." "She can't be real." "She is. My Grandad says she's lived around here for hundreds of years. She can't die. She's, what's the word? Immortal. Yeah, that's it. And you know she feeds on children. It's the children's blood that makes the widow live forever." Lily stared at her friend, expecting her to burst into laughter and yell, "Pranked!" But Megan's expression remained deadly serious, even a little scared. And that made Lily feel scared too, even if it was obvious the widow didn't really exist. They were silent for a minute. Lily wanted to go out in the garden, into the sunshine, to play with the dog and forget all about the stupid widow and Bloody Mary and scary video games. She wanted to go home and give Chesney a big squeeze and see her mum. They climbed up to the treehouse, and Barney ran around at the foot of the tree, barking. They chucked water balloons down and he chased them, getting splashed and jumping in the air, but always coming back for more. It was hilarious. Lily forgot all about the scary stuff Megan had been talking about indoors. Megan's mum came out into the garden. "Girls, it's tea time. Go and wash your hands. And Megan, Grandad's here." "Great!" Megan climbed out of the tree, and Lily followed. There was a little bathroom just inside the house. The girls went in to wash their hands. Then Lily followed Megan to the kitchen, where lunch was laid out. Sandwiches and crisps and slices of cucumber, beakers of orange squash. Lily hadn't realised how hungry she was. Megan's big brother Jake was there already, putting his fingers all over the crisps. Jake was 14, but according to Megan, was like a 5-year-old on the inside. Not long after Lily met Megan, she'd witnessed her friend fight another girl who called Jake retarded. Seeing the way Megan stuck up for her brother made Lily wish she had a sibling, someone she could look after. But how was that ever going to happen if her parents didn't like each other anymore? "Tuck in," said Megan's mum. As Lily concentrated on what food to choose, avoiding the crisps because she had a thing about food other people had touched, Megan shouted, "Grandad!" Lily looked up as Megan threw herself into the arms of a stocky, bald man who'd come into the kitchen. He gave Megan a hug and whirled her round, laughing, then saw Lily. He put Megan down. "Hello," he said. Lily stared at him. She knew him. He was the man who tried to help her when she fell off her bike. The man with crooked teeth. The stranger. Chapter 17. Karen stood on the doorstep of the retreat with her suitcase at her feet. The sun was out for the first time in months, and the breeze was soft against my face. Spring was finally here. "Are you sure you don't want to stay?" I asked. "I can't. Not after last night." She hung her head. "I'm so embarrassed." "Don't be. So, what are you going to do?" She lifted a shoulder. "Just go home, see the doctor, flush my stash down the toilet, finish my goddamn book. Maybe the countryside doesn't suit me. I need to be surrounded by people. The nights are too quiet here and my brain is too noisy." I get that. The taxi trundled up the driveway towards us. It was the same car, the same driver who'd given me a lift when I got lost in the woods. Ollie, that was his name. He got out and hefted Karen's bag into the boot, nodding at me and muttering, "All right?" "Did Julia talk to you about last night?" I asked Karen. "She tried. She asked me if I'd ever heard you singing this weird song, something about a fly." "And what did you say?" "That I couldn't remember, but it was possible." That was good. "We'd better get a move on if you're going to make your train," Ollie said. I gave Karen a quick hug and watched her go. Now, unless another writer turned up, it was going to be just me and the lovebirds. That was another thing that made me wonder. Less than a week ago, Susie had been upset with Max for trying to get into her room, and now she was inviting him in. What happened? Had he worn her down? Perhaps her original protests had been exaggerated. As Max had reminded me, it was none of my business. I went inside and found Julia in her usual spot by the Aga, phone to her ear. She finished her conversation and sighed. "That was the National Bat Helpline. They said it's quite unusual to find a bat in the attic at this time of year, but if you have a bat roost, as it seems I do, you have to leave well alone. It's illegal to disturb them." A little smile. "I'm actually quite happy about them being there. It's cool, isn't it? It's nice to give them a home." She drummed her fingers on the table. Have you heard any other noises coming from Lily's room? She asked. No. I watched as she chewed her lip. She was a mess of tics and visible tension. Julia, did you see a counsellor after Lily disappeared? It might help. She reacted angrily. The police offered a grief counsellor. I reminded them that there's no proof she's dead. But I know Michael is dead, and I should have seen a counsellor to talk about losing him, but I couldn't. I knew they'd want to talk to me about Lily, that they'd try to make me accept that she was dead too, so I didn't go. I couldn't. I nodded. I wasn't sure if she was right about what the counsellor might do. The one I'd seen had mainly listened and given me a chance to talk, but I understood that it was complicated. She couldn't separate what had happened to Michael from what might have happened to Lily. It seemed as if Lily's disappearance had robbed Julia of the ability to deal with her husband's death. "Come with me," she said, getting up. A minute later, we stood outside Lily's bedroom. Julia opened the door and gestured for me to follow her inside. As she stepped across the threshold, her breathing became noticeably heavier. She held a hand against her chest, and I could imagine her heart thumping beneath her palm. She clenched her jaw as if fighting against physical pain. "It's exactly as it was the day she disappeared," she said. It was a typical little girl's room. Pink curtains, open to let in the morning light. A single bed against the wall, covered with a purple and white bedspread, little cushions propped up against the headboard. A dressing table, covered with trinkets, little dresses hung from a rail, a bookcase bearing novels by authors like Roald Dahl and David Walliams, along with a book about folk tales that caught my eye. On the wall, a 2014 Taylor Swift calendar, along with posters featuring fresh-faced stars I didn't recognise. "Most of them are YouTubers," Julia said. "Micah was always complaining how much time she spent watching videos." I noticed an iPad on the bedside table. "I come in here every couple of weeks to charge it. I know she'll want to watch it when she comes home. She'll have a lot to catch up on." There was a huge pile of cuddly toys in the corner, every animal imaginable. On top of the pile was a large black and white cat, a smile sewn onto its face. "That's Big Cat," Julia said. I sucked in a breath. "The one that was in the river?" She nodded. "The police kept him for a while, but they let me have him back." She picked the toy up, pressed her nose against its scruffy fur. "He still smells of the river." She set it back on top of the pile. "Lily loved cats," she said. "She was obsessed with them from the first moment she saw one when she was a baby. It was actually her first word. Not mummy or daddy. Cat. And she always had two toys she loved more than anything. I think she might have loved them even more than she adored Chesney. Big Cat and Little Cat." I looked around. Little Cat was in her coat pocket when she vanished. I'm sure, she still has him with her." Julia's eyes shone, and she had to take a moment to compose herself. "I hope he's looking after her." "I'm sure he is." She sat down on the bed. "Do you think I'm crazy?" "Crazy? Of course not." "I'm sure most people think I am. They think I should clear out this room, move on. But I can't." She was trembling, one of her knees jerking up and down, her heel tapping against the floor. Tears rolled down her cheeks. There was a box of tissues by the bed. I plucked one out and handed it to her. I wanted to put my arms around her to comfort her, a basic human response, but had no idea if it would be welcomed. When the tears had abated, I said, "I understand why you leave this room as it is." "You do?" I wanted to tell her that I understood because even knowing Priya was dead, it had taken months for me to gather the strength to put away her things. Even now, they were all in boxes. I couldn't take that final step to remove her possessions from the flat. But I didn't think now was the time to bring it up. This conversation was about Julia and Lily. I also couldn't tell her about my investigation into Lily's disappearance. Not yet, when there was nothing concrete to share. "If I knew she was dead," Julia said, "I could take action." I wasn't sure what she meant by that, but nodded. "But I'm stuck." She looked up at me, eyes pink and sore. "It's like I dived into that river 2 years ago, and I'm still under the water, holding my breath." I went back to my room, feeling helpless and useless, wishing there was something I could do to help Julia, knowing only one thing would actually work, finding out what had happened to Lily. And that reminded me, Zara still hadn't called me back or responded to my messages. The notification beneath my last message said, "Delivered, not read." When had I last heard from her? Time was beginning to blur, but it was the day before yesterday in the pub. I called her, and again she didn't answer. What was going on? She'd given up? She could at least have the decency to answer my calls. I ought to be writing my novel, but there was no way I could concentrate now. I grabbed my car keys. I was going to look for Zara. Chapter 18. I pulled up outside the Apple Tree bed and breakfast, where Zara was staying. It was a few streets back from the river, on a long, quiet road with plenty of parking spaces. An elderly woman struggled home with bags of heavy shopping. A young father pushed a buggy containing a sleeping toddler. They were the only people around. The town had an abandoned feel to it, like there'd been an evacuation. On a nearby lamp-post, a tatty paper sign appealed for the return of a missing cat. Last seen, 23rd of June, 2015. 2 years ago. I hadn't seen any posters about Lily. Maybe that was because everyone assumed she'd drowned. I rang the bell, and a woman in her 60s answered. "Are you after a room?" she asked. Her hair was dyed auburn, and a cross hung around her neck on a gold chain. "I was actually looking for a friend of mine, Zara Sullivan. I believe she's staying here?" "Come on in," she said. I followed her into a cosy sitting room. A little dog with grey fur snoozed on the sofa. It lifted its head to regard me, then went back to sleep, snoring gently. "I'm Shirley, and this is Oscar," she said. A painting of Christ hung above the fireplace. On another wall, a tapestry with a quote from the Bible, "Hate what is evil, cling to what is good." "Romans 12:9, she said. "Are you a believer, Mr. Radcliffe?" She peered at me. Her eyes were milky, unfocused, cataracts. "Radcliffe? You're not David's son, are you?" Of course. She was the same age as my parents. Yes I am." "Well, look at you. All grown up, and very handsome, too. Not that I'm surprised. Your father was always a very good-looking man. How is he?" He passed away," I said. Her face crumpled. "What happened?" "Cancer." "Oh." Her hand went to the cross around her neck. "So, he was the first?" "The first?" I asked, but there was no response. "Shirley?" She fell into an armchair, still gripping the cross with one hand. She stared into space, into the past. "Are you all right, Mum?" The voice from the doorway made me jump. It was a woman in her early 40s with curly, reddish hair. She wore jeans and a tight black T-shirt. She was curvy, with long limbs, pale skin, and, strikingly, a tattoo of a red rose on her upper arm, the petals disappearing beneath her sleeve. She laughed, which made her look even more attractive. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you." Shirley snapped out of her trance. "My apologies, I was taking a trip down memory lane. This is my daughter, Heleth." "Pleased to meet you," I said. "What about your mum?" Shirley asked me. "Is she in good health?" "Oh, she's great." I explained how she and Dad had moved to Spain before he died, and that Mum was still out there. "They got away," Shirley said. "From this place, I mean. It used to be a thriving town, you know. The Apple Tree was always full up. But these days I can go weeks without anyone coming to stay. It's not surprising, I suppose. Sad, but not surprising. It's a punishment." Before I could ask what that meant, Heleth rolled her eyes. She crouched beside Shirley, laying a hand on the arm of her chair. "It's not that bad. We get by, don't we, Mum?" Shirley patted her hand. "Oh, I don't know what I'd do without you, my angel." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "It's been quite a week for terrible news. First Malcolm, then this." "Malcolm Jones, the librarian." Did you know him?" Heleth asked, in a surprised tone. "No. Well, not really." "Sorry, what do you mean? Did I know him? Has something happened?" "It was his heart," Shirley said. laying a hand across her own, as if checking it was still beating. "He suffered with a heart condition for years, so it wasn't a terrible shock. Dreadful, though. He was a good man. But he'll be with Sylvia now." I assumed that was his wife. "When did it happen?" I asked. "Only yesterday." Shirley patted her daughter's hand again. "How is Ollie coping?" "Oh, he's okay." Shirley nodded. "He's a good lad, like his father." She turned to me. "I keep hoping Ollie will make an honest woman of her." Ollie? That was the name of the taxi driver. Ollie Jones. So, he was Malcolm's son, and here was his girlfriend. It was a small town, all right, with a limited dating pool. But now, hearing about Malcolm's death, I was even more keen to talk to Zara. "So, my friend, Zara, is she here?" The dog jumped onto Shirley's lap, and she ran a hand along its flank. She'd retreated inside her head again. Away with the fairies, as my mum would say. "Zara Sullivan?" Heleth said. "Oh, she's gone." Her words didn't sink in immediately. "Gone?" "Yes, she went yesterday. Packed up, paid her bill and went." "But I was supposed to be paying for the room. Did she leave a message?" "No, she said something about her business here being done." I swore under my breath. How could she abandon the investigation without telling me? She was eccentric, sure, but I hadn't taken her for a flake. Maybe she'd paid for the room herself because she felt guilty and she wasn't answering her phone simply because she didn't want an argument with a disappointed client. But then I thought about how oddly she'd behaved in the pub the other evening, and how jumpy she'd seemed. Had something scared her away? "How did she seem yesterday?" I asked. Heleth took a seat on the sofa and crossed her legs. One Converse-clad foot bounced up and down. "Oh, this is very intriguing. What do you mean?" "Well, was she acting nervously, or was she relaxed?" "She seemed absolutely fine to me. She came down for breakfast, ate 3 rounds of toast, and we made small talk. She told me all about a case she'd once worked, something about a guy who went missing. They eventually found him chained up in a sex dungeon. He'd paid the dominatrix to keep him as her slave. We had a giggle over it." "She didn't say anything about the case she was working here?" "No, just something about hitting a dead end." "And you're sure she didn't seem scared?" "I'm sure. Why? Is there something she should have been scared of?" "I don't know." I said goodbye to Shirley, and Heleth saw me out. As I was about to leave, something occurred to me. "What did your mum mean when she said, 'It's a punishment'?" "Oh, who knows? Mum's always talking about sin and divine retribution, devils with red-hot pokers. I spent my childhood being warned that if I didn't clear my plate or tidy my room, I'd be punished by God. Or worse." "The devil, you mean?" "Oh, no, not him." She closed the door. Now what? I needed to know if Zara had discovered anything else. Had she met with Malcolm Jones before he died? I tried calling Zara's office number, but there was no answer. I sent an email from my phone, asking her to call me. A moment later, my phone pinged. It was Zara, replying. "Hey, Lucas, really sorry, but I decided to head home. I wasn't getting anywhere, and I couldn't stand being in that B&B a moment longer. Don't worry about my fee. I didn't get anywhere, and don't think anyone ever will. That girl is long gone. It's a total waste of time looking for her. Sorry again, Zara." Damn. So that was it? The end of the investigation? It was hard to accept that it was all over just like that, even though a voice in my ear whispered that it was a good thing, that I was wasting time on a wild goose chase. The voice also reminded me that I needed to get back to the retreat, do some work. I still had over 3/4 of my novel to write, and I was never going to get it done if I didn't buckle down to it. I'd been ignoring emails from my agent and editor, both asking when I expected to be finished. I needed to do what I'd originally come here for. I was desperate to help Julia, but I had no idea what to do next, or who to talk to. Chapter 19. Lily. 2014. Halfway through tea, Megan's granddad narrowed his eyes at her and said, "Where do I know you from?" Lily took a sip of orange squash. She found it hard to reply. It was like there was something stuck in her throat, and she had to take another sip before the words could get through. "In the park. You helped me when I fell off my bike." He clapped his hands together. "Of course. Well, I never." "What a coincidence," said Megan's mum, smiling at Lily. "It's a small town," Megan's granddad said. "We all know each other. Although I haven't met your parents properly yet, Lily. What do they do? For a job, I mean." Megan's granddad had a crumb stuck to his lower lip, which wobbled when he spoke. Lily stared at it, convinced it would drop at any second, but it clung on. "My mum's an illustrator, and my dad does stuff with computers." His eyebrows arched up towards his shiny head. "And what would you like to be when you grow up?" She shrugged. She hated it when grown-ups asked that. "I haven't figured it out yet." "I want to be a pop star," Megan said. "I'm going to be in a group, and I'll be famous." She broke into song, and her granddad beamed, his eyes shining with love and pride, until Megan's mum told her to be quiet and eat her tea. This meal was stretching on forever. Lily really wanted to get away from Megan's granddad. She didn't know why, but it was as if she were allergic to him, in the same way she was allergic to lamb's wool, which made her skin prickle and break out in a rash. She had seen how Chesney reacted when a dog walked past, his back going up and his tail getting fat. That's how Megan's granddad made her feel, even though he'd helped her in the park and he was being nice to her now, and Megan clearly thought he was the bee's knees. Megan's mum's phone rang. She took it over to the back door to talk to whoever it was. When the call ended, she came back and said, "Lily, that was your mum. She's not going to be able to pick you up." "Sleep over!" yelled Megan. Lily ignored her. "Why not? Has something happened?" Megan's mum put a hand on Lily's arm. "Relax, it's nothing bad. There's something wrong with the car, that's all. She asked if I can run you home." "Sleep over?" Megan tried again. "Megan, Lily hasn't got any of her stuff with her, and we have to go out first thing tomorrow." She looked at Jake, whose face was covered in jam and peanut butter, his clothes like the before in an advert for washing powder. "I can take her home," Megan's granddad said. No. "Oh, could you? That would be so helpful." "It's no bother." He grinned at Lily with his mouthful of crooked teeth. "No bother at all." Megan's granddad had a grey car that was spotless inside, cleaner than her parents' car had ever been. Lily sat in the front passenger seat on Megan's booster. It was incredibly annoying that she still had to sit on a booster despite being 8. She wound down the window to say goodbye. "I really wanted to have a sleepover," Megan said. "Next time," said her mum. "So, you live at Ninth Bran," Megan's granddad said, once they were on the main road. It was still bright and warm outside, the summer evening stretching on forever, but it was hot and stuffy in the car, and Lily felt sick. "Uh-huh." "Do you know what Ninth Bran means, Lily?" "Nest of the Crow." "That's right. I'm impressed." "My mum told me." He kept looking at her instead of the road. He mainly concentrated on her face, but sometimes his gaze slipped further down to her bare legs. It filled her with a peculiar sensation, like millions of little worms wriggling under her skin. "Did you have fun today with Megan? She told me you were playing her new computer game." She nodded. "I don't understand the appeal of those things myself. Give me a game of chess any day. Do you play chess, Lily?" "Yeah, my dad taught me." "Oh, that's marvellous. Maybe you can give me a game sometime, though you have to give me a chance." He hissed with laughter. "So, how long have you lived here, Lily?" He was one of those grown-ups who always said your name, even when you were the only other person around, like he had to keep saying it or he'd forget what it was. "Since last September." "Oh, not long. That'll be why I don't know your family. They keep themselves to themselves, don't they?" She had no idea what to say to that. "Where did you live before?" "Manchester." "United fan, eh?" He showed her his crooked teeth again. They were yellow, too. He must have a rubbish dentist, or maybe he never cleaned them. His eyes, which were also a bit yellowy where they ought to be white, roamed down to her legs again. "City," she managed. He started going on about how different it must be living here after growing up in a big city. It was such a familiar topic that it calmed her a little. She stopped gripping the seat so tightly and noticed how her hands had made sweaty marks on the black leather. "Dangerous places, cities," Megan's granddad said. They were halfway there now. 5 more minutes and she'd be home. "Still, It can be dangerous around here, too, he said.
Because of the witch, she whispered.
His eyes flicked sideways, and she could tell he was mulling over what to say. There was no other traffic on the road, but they were going slowly, as if he didn't want to take her home any time soon. A smile crept over his dry lips, which he kept licking between sentences. A little girl disappeared around here, he said. A long time ago now. Over 30 years. She lived at St. Mary's Children's Home in town.
Lily could hardly breathe. What was her name?
Caris. He kept grinning, and Lily realized something. He was one of those grown-ups who enjoyed scaring children. That was why he told Megan stories about the widow. He got some kind of weird thrill out of it. That didn't make what he was saying any less frightening, though.
What happened to her?
That's the thing. Nobody knows. She was never found. And you know what? She wasn't the first. There was a long, long silence, which stretched out until they reached the driveway to Lily's house. She exhaled with relief and fiddled with the door handle, desperate to get out. Megan's granddad's jaw muscles flexed like he was chewing over something, and the way he stared ahead, it was as if he wasn't seeing the road. He was seeing something inside his head. Here we are, Lily, he said, as they pulled up outside the house.
Thank you.
I'm sure I'll see you again soon. She opened the door and was so keen to get away she almost fell out of the car. Behind her, Mum came out of the house, raising a hand to thank Megan's granddad. He waved back. Lily was about to shut the car door when he leaned over and said in a hushed voice, Lily, be careful, yes? She watched him drive away, trying hard not to throw up. Part 2. Chapter 20. Over the next week or so, I settled into a routine, the kind I'd envisioned when I booked a place at the retreat. Each morning I rose at dawn to write, fueled by coffee, hardly seeing the rain that day after day beat against the window. My novel had taken on a momentum of its own, the threads of the story knitting together, and I was able to email my agent and publisher to tell them the book would be a couple of weeks late, but no more. I didn't see much of Julia during this quiet period, except at mealtimes or when I popped outside for some air. I didn't see much of Max or Susie either. They had both announced they had extended their stays, as they were making such good progress on their novels. There was clearly something in the air, but I wasn't sure if they were still sleeping together. I didn't really care. I didn't hear any singing that week. No mysterious passages appeared in my novel. There may have been events I was unaware of. I was so buried in my work, a headless horseman could have ridden through the kitchen downstairs, and I wouldn't have known about it. But, as I recall, the week passed without incident. Then, a new guest arrived, and everything changed. I skipped dinner because I was deep in a chapter and not particularly hungry, but went downstairs at around 8 to get a drink. There was a hubbub coming from the Thomas room, including a voice I didn't recognize. Julia was in the kitchen. When I'd seen her during the past week, she'd been withdrawn and businesslike, and I suspected she felt awkward after crying in my presence, exposing her emotions. She had wrapped a cloak of self-preservation around herself again. Now I felt awkward too, and found myself tiptoeing around her. There had been a moment when I thought that we would at the least become friends, but that moment appeared to have passed. I'd allowed it to happen. Partly it was because I didn't know how to help her. Now I'd given up on my secret quest to find Lily. But there was something else. Guilt. I was pretty sure Priya would have liked Julia. I was less sure she would want me to start any kind of relationship with her. Even thinking Julia was attractive felt like a betrayal. And the whole thing was one-sided anyway, I reminded myself. Julia didn't like me in that way. I was being ridiculous even thinking about it. Julia smiled at me. Lucas, you missed dinner. Do you want anything? I'm fine, thanks. A burst of male laughter came from the Thomas room. A new guest, she said. You should go and meet her. She's quite a character. She rolled her eyes and laughed, a slightly giddy laugh. I did a double take. Had she been drinking? Surely not. She busied herself stacking the dishwasher. Do you want a hand? I asked. No, go and meet the new guest. A fire burned in the hearth, bathing the room in a warm, flickering light. Max was on the sofa, with Susie beside him. Another woman sat in the armchair opposite. I guessed she was in her 50s. She had a dark Louise Brooks bob and wore several heavy necklaces. She was watching Max with an earnest, slightly perplexed expression. As I came into the room, Max said, "Ah, the reclusive horror writer. Lucas, this is Ursula."
"Ursula Clarke," she said,
in a moneyed voice. Her name rang a vague bell, but she clearly expected me to have heard of her. They were, I realised, holding wine glasses. A half-empty bottle stood on the coffee table. Had Julia rescinded the alcohol ban? It seemed as if my guess that Julia was tipsy had been correct, after all. "Ursula wrote The Spirit's Whisper," Max said with a little smirk. When Ursula wasn't looking, he winked at Susie, who didn't respond. She was studying Ursula with interest. "Oh, I've heard of that," I said. "It was a huge bestseller, wasn't it?"
"1 million copies sold,"
Ursula replied, faux nonchalantly. 10 years ago," Max said. Ursula's jaw tightened, and I felt a wave of sympathy. She was in the exact situation I dreaded, a flash of success followed by years of obscurity. The curse of the one-hit wonder. "Remind me what it was about," I said. "Sorry, I have a terrible memory."
"It was about my relationship with my spirit guide," Ursula said. "How she counselled me, told me secrets, helped show me the way towards wealth and happiness."
"I have an agent for all that," laughed Max. Ursula wasn't amused.
"I'm used to mockery," she said.
"I think it sounds fascinating." I sat down. Of course, I actually thought it was a load of hokum, but I wanted to get one over on Max, and like I said, I felt sorry for Ursula. "Tell me about it." "You might need a drink first," said Max, pouring one for me. He handed me the glass and I took a sip. Red wine, thick and delicious. "What happened to the booze ban?" I asked. "I don't know." Max scratched his head. "We came down for dinner tonight, and there it was, like a wonderful apparition." Ursula made a little noise in her throat.
"I think you might have me to thank. Julia told me about the dry nature of this place when I called to inquire about booking. I told her how absurd it was. A place for writers, with no alcohol. I said if she wanted this to be a viable business, she needed to get down to the nearest wine merchant pronto." Max raised his glass. "A toast to Ursula." Susie raised hers too. I didn't join in. As pleased as I was to have a glass of wine in my hand, I was the only one who suspected why Julia had an aversion to drink. "Anyway, Lucas, I was about to tell you about spirit guides."
Ursula put down her glass and sat back.
"All of us, even Max here, have a spirit guide. Someone who watches over us and helps us on our journey through this life. Tell me, Lucas, do you ever feel as if someone is watching you, looking after you? Perhaps you glimpse a presence sometimes when you're dreaming or in moments of high emotion."
Her words made my skin prickle, because sometimes I did feel as if I were being watched, especially since Priya's death. Especially, in fact, since I'd come here. She went on, "Some people, such as myself, are unusually sensitive. We are able to communicate directly with our guide. She tells me if someone has plans to harm me, and she tells me who I can trust. She also helps me communicate with the deceased, too, so they can pass on their wisdom." "Does she have a name?" I asked.
"Of course. Phoebe."
"And did Phoebe used to be a flesh-and-blood person?"
"Oh, yes, but hundreds of years ago."
She smiled, though there was a hint of sadness there, as if Ursula was talking about an old friend she hadn't seen for a long time.
"The good news," she said, "is that heaven is real. As soon as I realized that, I no longer feared death, and I truly started to live."
She allowed me to top up her wine glass along with my own. At the same time, Julia put her head around the door and said good night. As I heard her go up the stairs, it hit me, right in the stomach. I missed her. Missed the connection we'd made. Ursula noticed.
"You like her, don't you?"
I winced, but Max and Susie hadn't heard as far as I could tell.
"A lot of men are drawn to women with emotional pain," she said.
I cut her off. I wasn't that type of man. No, it's her inner strength that I like. Oh, so you do like her? She grinned, and I couldn't help but smile too. I like her, but that doesn't mean I like her. Ursula leaned forward. Her mouth was stained red from the wine. You can't fool me, she said. Remember, I see things. Is that how you know she's in pain? Because your spirit guide told you? She smiled. Actually, it was a taxi driver. Ursula waited until Julia's footsteps were no longer audible and said, The cabbie who brought me here from the station told me all about what had happened to Julia's husband and daughter. The others were tuned in now. Max looked as if he were watching a news bulletin announcing that a UFO had landed in Trafalgar Square. What did he tell you? I asked. Ursula repeated pretty much what Ollie the taxi driver had told me. And they never found her, she said in a theatrical whisper. Oh, poor Julia, said Susie. Hang on, said Max to me. You knew about this? The same taxi driver told me. And you didn't share? Why should I? I don't think it's right to gossip about Julia's pain. Ursula flapped a hand. Nonsense. It's not gossip. As Max says, it's sharing. People should be more open with one another. How else are we ever supposed to understand our fellows? Are you quoting from your book? I asked. Susie was staring into space. Maybe that's what Karen heard, she said. The little girl's ghost. They both looked at Ursula as if she might know the answer. She was loving it. Before I could interject, she said, It's possible. Spirits can become trapped in this realm. It could be that she is kept here by her mother's pain, unable to enter heaven. Oh, my God, I said to Max and Susie, do you really believe all this? No, of course not, Max said. Sorry, Ursula. This whole thing is making me sick, I said. Can you imagine what Julia's been through? Watching her husband drown, not knowing what happened to Lily? That's why— I stopped myself in the nick of time. Why what? Max asked. Nothing. But please, can we stop talking about ghosts and spirits? Want to save it for your books, eh? I understand. Max's smile was condescending. I stood up, and my head span. I must have had more to drink than I realized. I'm going to bed, I announced. Watch out for ghosts and ghoulies, Max laughed, as I exited the room. I showed him my middle finger. I went into the kitchen to get a glass of water. When I came out, I could hear Ursula talking, loud and indiscreet. It is possible, she said. Perhaps Lily's spirit is with us, and maybe she doesn't want us here. She wants to be alone with her mother. Chapter 21. I jerked awake. It was pitch black in the room, the kind of darkness you never get in cities, and my heart was pounding as if I'd awoken from a nightmare I couldn't remember. I squinted into the blackness, unable to see anything except spots of colour, indeterminate shapes shifting and blurring, but I was convinced someone else was in the room. Hello, I said, my voice louder than I'd intended. Someone was breathing on the far side of the bedroom. I was sure of it. I could smell something too. Dirt or sweat. Fear. I groped for my phone, which I was certain I'd left on the bedside table. I couldn't find it. I tried to locate the lamp, blind in the utter darkness. Finally, my fingers found the plastic switch and I pressed it. Nothing happened. For a moment, I was paralyzed, willing my useless eyes to adjust. The air around me was dark grey now, and I was certain there was a darker shape across the room. A person, watching me. The bedroom door opened with a click. Oh, Jesus, there was someone there. Immediately, it closed again. I jumped out of bed, found the light switch on the wall. The sudden light dazzled me, burning my retinas. Recovering, I stared at the door. Was the intruder still there, on the other side? I hadn't heard footsteps moving away. I was dressed in nothing but my underwear. I pulled a T-shirt over my head and opened the door. The hallway was illuminated by watery moonlight that crept through the window at the far end. There was no one in sight. I hesitated. Which way had they gone? I stood between the two staircases, made a choice, and headed down. A clattering came from the kitchen. I froze for a minute. Did I need a weapon? There was a poker by the fireplace in the Thomas room. I could go in there, grab that, then... Before I could make my mind up, someone came out of the kitchen. Susie. She gasped, slapping a hand against her chest. "Lucas, what are you doing? You nearly scared me to death." She was fully dressed, holding a mug of tea or coffee in her other hand. Some of it had sloshed over the edge of the mug when she'd seen me. She noticed what had happened and hurried back into the kitchen, returning with a cloth. "What are you doing up?" I asked. "I haven't been to sleep yet. And no, before you ask, I wasn't with Max." "It's none of my business." "True. Anyway, I was working. What are you doing up?" I dodged the question. "Did you see anyone come down here?" "No. Although I might not have heard them, because the kettle was boiling right next to me. Why?" "Hang on." I ran back up the stairs and continued to the next floor. I checked both ends of the hallway, even poking my head into the broom closet. I glanced up at the attic. There was no way someone could have got up there without making a great commotion getting the ladder down. Whoever it was had vanished. They must have snuck out the front door and would be long gone now. I went back to the ground floor and joined Susie in the kitchen. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" she asked. "Like, why are you walking around in your boxer shorts?" There was someone in my room. Her eyes widened. "What? Are you sure?" My door opened and closed. I heard them leave the room. "Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" "I'm certain." She looked at me skeptically, and I caught sight of my reflection in the window. My hair was sticking up in a mad professor style. I could smell the alcohol on my breath, too. "You were pretty het up when you went to bed," she said. "That happens to me sometimes. If I go to bed angry or upset, I have bad dreams." "It felt real," I insisted. "Well, is there anything missing from your room?" she asked. I went upstairs, Susie following, and entered my room. Had anything gone? My laptop was still on the desk, my notebook beside it. "I had a pen. Right here," I said. "I mislay pens all the time," Susie said. "No, you don't understand. This was a special pen. I always know exactly where it is. Priya had given it to me for my birthday, shortly before I started to make notes for Sweetmeat. It was the last thing she ever gave me. It wasn't hugely expensive, but it was valuable to me. And not just because she'd given it to me. I'd used it to rough out the outline of my breakout book. I might pride myself on being a rationalist, but I was superstitious about this pen. It was my equivalent of Samson's hair. The thought of losing it made me go cold. "Hang on," I said, noticing the absence of something else. "Where's my phone?" It wasn't on the bedside table. I checked between the table and the bed. It wasn't there. I looked in the pocket of my jeans where I sometimes left it. I pulled the quilt off and lifted the pillows. I was convinced I was going to find it, and that Susie would think I'd imagined the whole thing. But the phone was nowhere to be seen. I half pulled the room apart, searching for it and the pen. "See?" I said. "They've gone. Pen and phone. Someone's taken them. Now do you believe me?" She scanned the room very slowly and wrapped her arms around herself. "I believe you," she said, with the smallest shudder in her voice. "But who? I don't know." Her eyes widened. "What if Ursula's right?" I scoffed. "What? You think a ghost took my stuff?" She sat on my bed. It was 3 a.m. The world outside was silent. I'd woken up convinced someone was in my room after spending the evening talking to someone about spirits and ghosts. Over the past couple of weeks I'd heard nocturnal singing from the room next door. Birthday candles had extinguished themselves. Karen had fled this place after hearing a voice threatening her, and Susie had experienced someone trying to open her door. It was hard to remain wholly rational. "I must admit," Susie said, "I'm feeling pretty freaked out right now." "Listen, ghosts don't steal people's phones." I sat beside her on the bed. Also, why would a spirit need to open and close the door? They'd just drift right through it, wouldn't they? That elicited a smile. "True. It's just everything Ursula says about spirit guides and heaven. Wouldn't it be amazing if it was true? It's like, if Julia believed in heaven, maybe she would be able to accept that Lily isn't coming back." The adrenaline drained from my system, and I yawned. "I should let you sleep," Susie said. I don't think I'll sleep now.
She looked at me. I can stay if you want. Hurriedly she added, I mean, to keep you company.
It's okay, I said, not sure if I was relieved or disappointed that she wasn't offering to sleep with me. This was a very confusing night. I might try to get some writing done. I should take advantage of the mood.
Sure.
She got up, hesitated.
I was thinking maybe we should ask Ursula to talk to Julia. It might comfort her.
I really don't think so. She's never going to accept that Lily is dead, not unless she sees proof. Susie said good night and left me alone in the silence. I lay down, intending to rest my eyes for a minute before starting work. Sunlight dragged me from sleep. Groggy and hungover, I got dressed and headed outside, hoping a kick of cold air might make me feel more human. Ursula was in the front garden, by the fence that Rodri had fixed, wearing an expensive-looking red coat. She saw me and waved me over, smiling broadly. It was a bright, mild morning. Low clouds hung over the distant mountains, and the trees in Julia's garden were alive with blossom. Birds passed overhead, returning from hotter climes. Apart from their calls, a hush hung over the land.
Such a wonderful place, isn't it?
Ursula said. She was, I noticed, almost shaking, giving off the air of someone who'd just won the lottery.
I knew it. I knew if I came somewhere quiet, away from the city.
Sorry, you've lost me, I said. Her eyes shone.
Last night, Phoebe spoke to me. Oh, it was so wonderful to hear her again. I thought I'd lost my gift, that I was being punished for sharing the secret with the world and benefiting materially from it.
She grabbed my wrist.
But she's back. She's back.
For a moment, I thought she was about to fall to her knees and raise her face to the sky to give thanks. Despite my cynicism about such things, her excitement was contagious. But then she said,
Phoebe told me about you, Lucas, about your loss.
I stared at her.
You deserve to be happy, and maybe you could make Julia happy too.
How do you know about... I stopped myself. Perhaps she didn't really know anything, but was fishing, making guesses like those self-proclaimed clairvoyants who make broad statements and convince their victims they have real insight. Then again, she might have found a story about Priya online. I had forbidden my publicist from telling anyone about my girlfriend's death because I didn't want it to look like I was capitalizing on tragedy. I'd worried it might leak, that a journalist would find out and write a story, tragic past of best-selling author. But fortunately the press weren't interested in authors and books, not unless your name was J.K. Rowling. The only explanation, if she wasn't guessing, was that she'd called her agent or publisher and asked about me. It made me feel violated. I don't have time for this, I said. I half jogged back to the house, Ursula's words ringing in my ears. Suddenly, I had a bad feeling about her coming here. I muttered a curse to myself as I entered the kitchen.
Are you all right?
It was Julia. She was seated at the breakfast bar, writing in a black ledger. I couldn't think of a suitable response. I didn't want to worry her by telling her about my nocturnal intruder, and I definitely didn't want to recount my conversation with Ursula. She filled the silence.
You seem a bit out of it.
Do I? I didn't sleep well, and I can't find my phone. I feel lost without it.
I'm sure it will turn up.
She carried on making notes for a minute, then said,
I saw you in the garden, talking to Ursula. I told you she was a character.
That's one way of putting it.
You don't like her?
I hesitated before saying, I felt sorry for her at first, but now I think... Well, I think she's dangerous. Julia put down her pen, which I squinted at to check it wasn't mine.
That's a bit extreme, isn't it?
No, she...
Hang on, she's coming.
Ursula entered the kitchen.
Has the kettle just boiled? I could murder a chamomile.
Julia smiled at my grimace.
Coming right up?
She reached for a box of herbal tea bags.
I've got some biscuits here somewhere. Shortbread.
She opened a cupboard and frowned.
That's weird.
Can't you find them?
No, they were definitely here yesterday. Maybe one of the guests took them.
She tutted.
Someone's been helping themselves to my tampons out of the bathroom, too.
She picked the tea bags up again. I was about to tell Julia about Karen's missing sandwich when Ursula said, "I just saw a little girl outside." Julia dropped the box of tea bags. They scattered over the counter. "What did you say?" All the colour had drained from her face. Ursula gestured towards the window. "There was a little girl, just beyond that field beside the house, on the edge of the woods." "How old was she?" Julia said. "What did she look like?" "Well, my eyesight isn't what it used to be. Tell me." About 10, I think. Brown hair, skinny as a pole." Julia dashed out of the kitchen and through the front door. Ursula stared after her, then turned to me. "What the hell are you up to?" I demanded. "I'm not up to anything, dear. Simply reporting what I saw." I shook my head, then followed Julia out of the door. I found her standing by the fence at the far end of the garden, gazing across the field of overgrown grass. "Lily was always searching for Chesney in this field," she said. "Michael told us something about there being rabbits here. Not that I've ever seen one. And Lily became convinced it was Chesney's hunting ground." "This is what I mean about Ursula being dangerous," I said. "She's trying to fill your head with nonsense about spirits and apparitions." Julia hoisted herself onto the fence, swinging a leg over. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to look in the woods." "Julia?" She turned to me, and her expression told me there was no point arguing. "What if she saw Lily? What if she's out there, too scared for whatever reason to come to the house? Or maybe she was about to come back and Ursula frightened her off." She was over the fence now, making her way through the grass towards the line of trees. I sighed and climbed after her. The grass clutched at my ankles and the ground squelched, still wet from all the rain that had fallen the previous week. I caught up with Julia, who stood on a little path just inside the wood. "Lily," she called. "Lily, are you there? Sweetheart, it's me, it's Mummy." "Julia, there's no one here," I said. "It's Ursula. She's trying to mess with your head. You should tell her to leave right now." She wasn't listening. She stared into the trees, fresh tears on her cheeks. I was furious with Ursula. What was she playing at? "She was here," Julia said, her voice thick with distress. "I can feel it. I can feel her." And then she smiled. The hope in her eyes broke my heart. "She's alive, Lucas. She's really alive." She embraced me, her face against my chest, hot tears soaking through my shirt. I held her and let her cry for a minute until she pulled away, wiping her cheeks with her sleeves. "Oh, God, I'm such a state. I'm so embarrassing," she said. What was I supposed to do? Insist that Ursula had been lying? Tell her Lily had to be dead, that there was no way she could be standing here watching the house? I couldn't do it. "She must be hungry," Julia said. "I should bring some food. Leave it here. Some warm clothes, too. And a note, telling her not to be afraid. Yes, that's what I'll do." She ran out of the woods, back into the field and towards the house. Looking at the trees all around me, I made a silent vow. If I couldn't persuade Julia to kick Ursula out, I had to do what I could to limit the damage. "Ursula," I said to myself, "I'm watching you." Chapter 22. Ursula was nowhere to be seen when I got back to the house. I figured she'd gone back to her room. Julia was in the kitchen, filling a basket with snacks and fruit. She made a cheese sandwich and wrapped it in cling film. It was all very Little Red Riding Hood. Won't it get eaten by animals? I said. She stared at the basket. You're right. I need something more